Welcome to Sewer Mutant, the podcast that doesn't need a tagline, because if you're listening to this, you probably already know what you're getting yourself into. I'm your host, Clint Finley. I'm joined, as always, by my co-host, John Eckelberry. If you want more comic book history, check out sewermutant.com. You can also find John's James O'Barr collector site at jamesobarr.wordpress.com. Our music is by Crudler, and you can find more of his work at crudler.bandcamp.com. And now, on with the show. Today, we're continuing our ongoing series on the Dark Age of comic books, which roughly covers the North American comic books from the mid-1980s to the end of the 90s. But we're setting the stage with some discussions of materials from before the Dark Age. Last episode, we discussed Alex Sinner's comic book series from the 1970s. Now we're flashing forward to the early 90s with Warrior magazine, the anthology that first published Alan Moore's groundbreaking Marvelman and V for Vendetta comics. But first, John, I have a burning question for you. Are you a cat person or a dog person?
Cat person.
Me too. Good. We have that in common. Yeah. No, we should give the listeners a little bit of information about who we are, because we always just jump right into the comics. What makes you more of a cat person, do you think?
I've had my one cat for like 20 years. She's a sweetie. And then our second one is, I don't know, probably 8 or something like that. But I had a cat as a kid as well. I've never had dogs. I don't know. Maybe if I had it all to do over again, I would have dogs and learn how to play guitar, because women seem to like that. But I'm a cat guy.
Yeah, dogs definitely get you out of the house more and help you meet people. You take them for walks and stuff. Probably a good, healthy option to have. I'm a cat person too, but I mean, you can see where some people wouldn't be a cat people. They kind of just like to torment you. And maybe that's a good segue into our topic for today, because we're talking about some of Alan Moore's earliest work. And some of that earliest work, though not in Warrior magazine, was a comic strip called Maxwell the Cat, which he did for his local newspaper. And it was just a pretty straightforward little comic strip about a cat just kind of driving people up the wall. But why don't we get into Warrior? John, do you want to tell us a little bit about what Warrior is?
Yeah, so Warrior is an anthology magazine that came out in the early 80s in Britain. The editor was Des Skin, who some people like to refer to as like the British Stan Lee. He worked on a lot of projects over there, including stuff from Marvel UK. A whole bunch of artists and writers that we came to know later got their start here. Alan Moore, of course, you already mentioned, and his friend Steve Moore, no relation. Some of the artists in here, of course, David Lloyd on V for Vendetta. You've got this cool strip called Axel Pressbutton and Laser Eraser, and that one has art by Steve Dillon, who is a favorite of mine. And I love Steve Dillon's work later on. He also did work for 2000 AD, which I'm sure a lot of these guys did. They probably worked for both. And then there's a few different artists on Marvelman. Gary Leach, Alan Davis, also fantastic artists that we see pop up later in both UK and American comics. I like anthologies anyway. I'm a big fan of Caliber Presents, which we might talk about at some point. Marvel Comics Presents was something that I bought when I first started buying comic books and got into that. I've got the whole run of that. But this is a pretty cool series. And the Alan Moore stuff in particular is great, but there's other good stuff in here too. There's long-running strips. There's 4 really kind of core long-running strips, and then there's some one-offs, and then a few that just pop up here and there.
Yeah. And maybe we should add some context for listeners who might not be familiar with British comics. The anthology is kind of the dominant form there, especially back then, or maybe it's less so now, I'm not sure. But in the 70s and early 80s, most comic books there, as far as I can tell, were black and white anthology comics that were published generally weekly and just had several short strips. And the Marvel UK ones tended to have reprints from American Marvel comics, but printed in black and white, along with original stuff by British creators like Steve Moore and Dave Gibbons and Steve Dillon and others. So most of these creators who were in Warrior also worked for Des Skin on a weekly anthology called Hulk Comic that obviously featured the Hulk, but also some other characters. And it seems like Des Skin kind of tried to lift and shift a bunch of the creators from that onto similar stories in Warrior. I'm kind of running through it. So you mentioned Marvelman and Axel Pressbutton. There's also Spiral Path by Steve Parkhouse. that runs through most of the issues that we're talking about today. I should also mention we're talking about issues 1 through 12 today, and we'll talk about the rest of the run in a follow-up episode. What else is there? There's Shandor by Steve Moore and John Bolton, and there's Madman. I forget the artist on that.
Paul Neary, I think. That one had, I think, 6 installments. Yeah, starting in issue 2.
Paul Neary would go on to actually run Marvel UK, I think, or be the one of the head editors at Marvel UK much later on.
I remember seeing his name on. I was buying the Death's Head 2 stuff when it was coming out in the 90s, but I did notice, I went back and read the older Death's Head stuff, and Jeff Sr. is the author or the artist on those, and he did that character in the UK Transformers comic as well. And his name pops up in Warrior here. He does just some guest inks on Spiral Path in like one of the chapters. I just happened to notice it today, but all these creators probably knew each other and were working together.
Yeah. Like I said, most of them had worked on Hulk comic. Alan Moore and maybe John Bolton are the outliers there, and then most of them had also worked on 2000 AD at some point, and other places. So at this point in Moore's career, he started out doing a lot of kind of underground comics. He actually wrote and drew his early stuff, and it's interesting to me that he said he stopped because he wasn't that good, and Elizabeth Sandifer, who is doing this kind of ongoing book project, that the first book of it is already been published, The Last War in Albion, which is about the rivalry between Alan Moore and Grant Morrison, but is also basically like an occult history of 20th century and 21st century pop culture. She was kind of dismissive, I think, of Moore's artistic talent. To be honest, when I look at his old stuff, I think if I was alive back then and somebody told me that in the future this creator was going to become famous and like one of the most respected people in his field for either the writing or art or drawing, I would have guessed probably the drawing, because I don't know, I wasn't that taken by a lot of those early strips that he did, but they were more like humorous kind of gag strips and stuff, not really what he would go on to be known for, doing serious long form dramatic work. And that really starts here in Warrior. Before this, he had switched over to writing, and he'd done some short stuff for Doctor Who Weekly, for Empire Strikes Back Weekly, and of course 2000 AD. But Marvelman and V for Vendetta are the beginnings of the Alan Moore we know and love today, I think. And so that's the big reason that we're exploring this. But it's interesting to look at the other stories here too for some of that historic context. So Steve Moore was not just Alan Moore's friend, but really his mentor, who helped him get started in the industry. He actually took over writing some stuff that Moore drew in those early underground days when Moore was busy or dispirited. So that's actually where Axel Pressbutton comes from. Were some strips that Steve Moore filled in on I think those were in Black Star magazine, where some of the art for something that Alan Moore had finished were stolen out of an editor's car, and Moore just was kind of not sure how to proceed or didn't want to redraw what he had already done. Steve Moore wrote this story, I think it's called Four Eyes McGurk, and it had Axel Pressbutton as one of the characters. Later, Moore was doing for Sounds magazine, with an alternative magazine in Britain, a series called The Stars My Degredation, that was a humorous sci-fi space opera type thing that Steve Moore ended up taking over the writing on, with Alan Moore continuing to draw, which is still just kind of an odd thing that see Alan Moore drawing but not writing something, and that reintroduced Axel Pressbutton. And so then the character returns again in Warrior, but now drawn by Steve Dillon, and some of Steve Dillon's fairly early work when he was quite young when he was doing this. He had also worked on Hulk comic, doing Nick Fury with Steve Moore, starting when he was, I think, 16 years old. And looking at that early Steve Dillon stuff, it's really impressive how talented he was so early on. Maybe that's why Alan Moore and Grant Morrison got dispirited with their drawing, that they saw how good Steve Dillon was already at his age.
I have to imagine that's true, right? Like when you're comparing with your peers and somebody's just really super strong out of the gate. Like for me, Dillon is kind of one of the greats. I mean, not everybody's a super fan of him, but like, man, I've loved everything that I've ever read that he's illustrated. He's just fantastic. And there's more stuff out there still for me to explore. I mean, unfortunately, he's gone now, but he's left a huge body of work behind. And so there's other stuff for me to read.
Yeah, I've always liked him, but I don't know. I was never like a super fan of his work, but there's something about maybe seeing these black and white pages for Axel Pressbutton, and there's something like just really beautiful and flowy about how they are presented that I can't put my finger on, that just make them better than. I mean, it's a fairly silly comic with just a lot of kind of gratuitous violence, and it's not particularly funny. I don't know. It is what it is, but Steve Dillon's work on it just elevates it in a way, and it's one of the better strips in Warrior that isn't by Alan Moore.
And it gets the cover spot on the first issue,
Yeah,
probably because it had already appeared, and it had a little bit of recognition for readers. Also, I don't know exactly how much lead time they had, but in the editorial in the first issue, they talk about taking some extra time to get everything right for this first issue so that they'd be super strong out the gate. And it really is. I mean, like, this first issue is very strong, like across the board.
yeah. I think I think it's really solid. This also has a non-ongoing strip that was by Steve Moore and Dave Gibbons. Go ahead. Dave Gibbons is in there. Steve Bolton is in there. Steve Dillon is in there. Both of the Moores are in there. Steve Parkhouse, who I don't know, I don't think he's super well known in the U.S. or anything. I don't know that he really carried over a whole lot, but it seems like he was a fairly big deal in the UK at that point in time. He had done Black Knight in Hulk comic, and that featured Captain Britain and led into the story arc that Alan Moore ended up taking over on Captain Britain. David Lloyd, obviously, doing V for Vendetta, done a lot of work in the British scene already, including some work with Alan Moore on Doctor Who. So it was a really solid lineup of creators. And even if some of these stories kind of fell off, like I think neither of us was very excited about Shandor, especially after John Bolton stopped drawing it, for me at least. Nonetheless, like the strong.
Yeah, I think the John Bolton segments are pretty cool. And I actually think the art throughout is fine. Even after he leaves, I think the art's pretty strong in this, but it kind of became a slog to read that one, I feel like. And I kind of fell off. When I first started reading these, I was trying to consume them as complete issues. So, I'd read all of issue 1 and then all of issue 2. But then what I found, going forward is I started to get a little more anxious to read the strips that I liked. And so I would read I'd go through and read all of Marvelman and all of V for Vendetta and then all of Spiral Path. And I didn't actually make it through Father Shandor, but I probably, when we talk about the back half, I'll circle around to it and talk about it some more, because those are the 4 main strips. Spiral Path, though, is in these first 12 issues, and then that's it. It actually has like a whole concluding story, and then it doesn't appear in the second year of the magazine. It's replaced by a few other things. But Shandor does continue, so there's more Shandor to read going into the future. And then, of course, Marvelman and V continue as well. V is the most represented strip at 25 of the 26 issues. I think Marvelman's something like 20. So, yeah, Spiral Path's kind of interesting, though. Spiral Path, the Steve Parkhouse one, reading it, and it's kind of interesting. It didn't have any like super highs or lows for me. It's kind of episodic, and some of the episodes, when you get to episode 12 and you realize that's the whole story, you think, oh, well, they like spent a lot of time on like this one segment that doesn't seem like it has that much to do with the rest of it. But I don't know.
Yeah.
What did you think about Spiral Path?
So it's odd. I don't think it hangs together very well as a whole story. I think if you were to just read it as I actually bought the Eclipse reprints of it, and I think if you were to just read those issues as a straight story, it would just be like, what is this? It kind of jumps from one thing to another. It's not very, like, the conclusion isn't very satisfying. Parts of it seem rushed and other parts of it seem drawn out. And yet, reading it in issue to issue, in with all the other stuff that's in Warrior, I found it surprisingly readable and enjoyable reading it that way. where each segment was just kind of a fun little thing to read in between other strips, other stories. And I don't know. Yeah, it spoke to me, I guess, a little bit, even though I can see that it's not really that good from a writing standpoint. The art I thought was good, but I mean, Parkhouse is up against some real heavyweights in Warrior.
Yeah.
And in terms of like the fantasy stuff, even though I think I enjoyed reading Spiral Path a lot more than Shandor. I mean, I keep mentioning John Bolton, but I mean, he was just so good that it's hard not to compare Parkhouse to him when they're both doing the same kind of genre of comic and those, right in the same pages. So, fairly good. And I think now we can maybe get into the Alan Moore of it all. V for Vendetta. You mentioned to me that you thought that it was some of like the strongest storytelling you'd ever seen in those first.
Yeah, I think that the first like installment in particular just like sucked me in a way that, I mean, I've liked V from before, but it's been years since I've read it, and I don't know, the power of the art, and I think the really heavy black lines and the storytelling and the sense of motion. It's funny because we talked about it, and I don't think that it hit you the same way it did me. In fact, I think you maybe like it less than you used to like it. But for whatever reason, V to me was just really, really strong. I thought that Marvelman would be my favorite thing, and I do really like Marvelman, but V for sure is like the cream of the crop for me when it comes to the strips in here. Marvelman's like really weird, and we'll talk about that in a minute too. But the first couple episodes are super strong, but then like it gets a little strange. Like it really kind of goes in some weird directions. And when you're doing a serial like this and you're doing like 8 pages at a time or whatever, I can see how that could happen because they just have to be like, okay, well, what are we gonna do this month with our, especially if he's writing multiple strips, like, Alan Moore was writing V and Miracle Man, and then also some of the other like one shots or whatever.
Yeah. Plus he was doing Captain Britain. He was still doing Maxwell the Magic Cat. He was still doing Stars My Degredation for at least some of that time. He was doing lots of stuff for 2000 AD at that time. After he started doing Marvelman and V for Vendetta and Warrior, 2000 AD finally gave him his first ongoing story in 2000 AD, which was Skiz, which was kind of a ET knockoff, and then
I read
that. DR and Quench. So he had a pretty full plate when he was doing all of these. It's a pretty impressive amount of output. V didn't hit me quite the same way revisiting it. So I mean, the first time I read it, I was a freshman in college. And I actually read it. It was almost 25 years to the day when I started rereading it, because I started my reread in November, and I remember it was Thanksgiving break when I read V for Vendetta the first time in 2000. So that was a big long break to come back to. It started warming up to it more as it went on, but the earlier strips didn't strike me that well, especially not compared to how strong I remembered it being before. And then the other thing is, it's interesting to look at some of this stuff that in black and white, where I think Marvelman definitely needs color. It's a superhero story. He's got the blue suit that just really pops. Just needs it should be in color. They have to keep like mentioning, what's his name, Mr.
He's so weird. Yeah. That's an interesting character.
Yeah, they have to keep mentioning like that his teeth are like that blue sapphire color because it's black and white, so they have to tell you the color. It just does kind of weird. And in V, it's interesting because I think it's intentional, but the artwork gets like murky to me because when it's only black and white, a lot of everything starts to blend. A lot of the things start to blend together, and it gets kind of hard to see the action at times or see what things are or tell what things are.
It feels like this strip is in perpetual night, and I don't know if it's necessarily supposed to be all set at night in the storyline, but it feels that way.
Yeah, for sure.
Which is kind of interesting in and of itself. But yeah, I think that this story's probably both benefited from color. Marvelman more so than V. I kind of like it in black and white, but
yeah,
it's interesting that they both got exported and then colored later by Eclipse, right? And then both continued too, because if you read through all of Warrior, that's not the end for either of those characters. They both got additional material from Moore for the follow-up series.
Right. Yeah, I think V was colored by DC, not by Eclipse. So most of the other stuff.
Oh, yes, you're correct.
Yeah.
You're correct.
Most of the stuff from Warrior,
Marvelman.
got reprinted was Eclipse, but yeah, V for Vendetta is the
I
exception
wonder
there.
why. I wonder how that broke down. I wonder if, I mean, Moore did work for DC too, but I wonder if maybe David Lloyd also did some kind of DC work that gave him an in there. I wonder why that one wasn't picked up by Eclipse and the other ones were.
Yeah, I don't
It'd be an
know.
interesting thing to.
Yeah, so for listeners that are curious, Marvelman was reprinted by Eclipse in the States as Miracle Man, and they also reprinted Axel Pressbutton and Spiral Path. And you can find a lot of those issues for fairly cheap if you're interested. And actually, the Warrior magazines, apart from some of the early ones, are not too terribly expensive on the back issue market. So this stuff is definitely findable, but you can also easily find scans of it, which is how I've been mostly reading it. I hate to do that, but for these, it was a kind of a big undertaking. I did buy some of them. I think, John, you got all of
sometimes
them.
you have to. Sometimes you
Yeah.
have to. I owned like the first maybe 6 issues prior, and they were in pretty nice shape. And I'm really kicking myself. I've bought and sold a lot of things over the years, a lot of comics, and I wish I hadn't have sold those. I sold them for kind of a stupid reason. They're too big to fit in regular US magazine size boxes. They're a little bit bigger. And so I didn't have like a great way to store the ones that I had in with the rest of my collection. And so it was one of the things that I cut because I was like, well, I've got the Eclipse printings and the DC printings of Miracle Man and V. Maybe I don't need them. And then I just when we started talking about it, really wish that I had them again. And then I got lucky and I found somebody that had a complete set of all 26 issues, and I just bought them from them. So,
Yeah.
I mean, if you try to buy them singly, the first issue is really expensive now, but the rest of them aren't that bad.
Yeah. Yeah, Marvelman for me was kind of the opposite experience of V, because I also read the first Eclipse trade paperback of that in college, which is kind of crazy in retrospect because I think it was selling on the back issue market for like $400 at that point, and somebody just lent it to me. But I didn't really like it. I remember finding it kind of dull, and I think in retrospect, probably it was an issue with pacing, and I think it has a lot to do with having to break the story down into those 8-page chunks where you're kind of constantly having to recap things. And Marvelman it's not too bad about that, where it's, it doesn't have somebody like restating the entire plot of the previous installments in the first few panels of every installment, but it's still, there's still like rehashing of things more frequently than you might want, and having the cliffhanger type ending every 8 pages is weird that it doesn't make it more exciting. It actually kind of makes it slower to get through somehow, which is kind of surprising, but that's how it works, I guess. But yeah, I ended up liking it more this time around, and I guess I also was kind of, or maybe a little bit the opposite of you. I thought it started a little bit slow, but then once Kid Marvelman shows up, and I think that's the 3rd chapter, I thought it got a lot more interesting there. Like when felt like the plot really started there, and the first couple were just kind of setting things up, and then the story really starts moving. And I don't remember any of that from reading it before. I even wonder if maybe I gave up too early into it or something. But
I only have the first 6 issues of the Eclipse run because they were the cheap ones. And for those later issues, the ones that have the content, I think probably the content that's not in Warrior, that came later, especially that last issue 15, was like, or at least the last Alan Moore issue anyway, was super expensive for a really long time. And then years and years and years later, Marvel, acquired the rights and reprinted it again. And I don't know. I bought some of those, but I didn't like the colors that much in them, and it was really kind of weird to have it on the super glossy paper and all that. I'd like to get the rest of the Eclipse issues at some point.
Yeah, the Eclipse color is definitely the better version. I think those are the definitive versions of the book, or of Miracle Man anyway, of Marvelman / Miracle Man is those Eclipse ones. Yeah, and you said it starts getting weird after those first couple chapters of setup. Yeah, I mean, we're really getting Alan Moore finally kind of getting to start to realize some of his ideas. One of the interesting things, so some of his very first work is, it was in a poetry magazine that he edited when he was a teenager, his late teens. It was called Embryo, and the 4th issue of that, mostly it's poems and drawings, by him and his friends. But the fourth one actually has a comic that's like 3 or 4 pages long, and it's called Once They Were Daemons. And I couldn't quite follow the story in it, but it's about this guy waking up on a ship or somewhere in the future or something like that, and in like a cryo chamber, and someone's speaking to him telepathically. But he's being menaced by some sort of entities called the Quiz, like QYS, and either he or somebody else in it, it's not very clear, identified as warp wizards. And so then in the Warrior summer special, which is also Warrior issue 4, there's a Marvelman story that takes place in the future, and it has the Warp Smiths. Then the Warp Smiths get some of their own stories a little bit later in Warrior. And it reveals that they're in this conflict with these alien creatures called the Quiz. Again, spelled the same way, QYS. So he's got this idea from when he was a teen that he finally is bringing into Marvelman years and years later. And then in Lance Parkin's biography of Alan Moore, he actually explains some of the origins of Moore's idea on Marvelman is that he picked up like a Mad Magazine anthology that had the Super Duper Man parody in it and an old issue of Marvelman, and had his own idea for like a Marvelman parody where Marvelman was grown up, or the guy that turns into Marvelman is grown up and can't remember the magic word that turns him into Marvelman. And so he kept that idea from when he was a kid all the way up,
awesome.
all the way up into Warrior. There's also in the biography, it explains that he had this big plan that he wanted to do a space opera series. I think it was called Sun Dodgers, that he wanted to do for 2000 AD. But it was just like too big of a project for an unproven writer. But it had all these characters in it, and some of those characters ended up turning up in his Doctor Who comics in the 4D War as the special executive. And then the special executive also came up in his Captain Britain run. And there's also one of the characters from Sun Dodgers was supposed to be a character who had been experimented on in Room 5. And so you can see the echoes of that in V for Vendetta.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
He also had done a pitch for a British publisher when he just not long after I think he was expelled from high school. I think it was called The Doll, and the idea was there was going to be some sort of like transvestite anarchist character who wore a like a porcelain mask or something like that. So there's just, you can see him taking all these ideas that have been stewing around. I mean, Axel Pressbutton is even kind of the same way for Steve Moore, just a character that had been floating around in these underground comics for years and years, and then finally got the right format, the right venue to fully explore in the right way.
I like that idea that they kind of, and maybe that's part of why it feels as strong as it does, because it's a more fully formed idea of something that, that they'd already explored before. I mean, I'm sure our listeners already know the history of Marvelman, but for anybody that doesn't, the very quick rundown is that, of course, in the beginning, there was Superman. And then Fawcett Comics made a Superman knockoff called Shazam, who's now owned by DC many years later after they sued Fawcett and got the rights to it. And the only real difference between Shazam and Superman is that Shazam's like a magical character. And so he's a kid, Billy Batson, that says a magic word, Shazam, and he becomes Captain Marvel. And in England, they ran out of Captain Marvel reprints and they wanted more. So they got a guy, Mick Anglo, to continue the series, but they had to tweak it a little bit. And so he came up with this character, Marvelman, who's just a knockoff of Shazam. He's the same thing, but, the names are changed or whatever. Now, instead of Billy Batson, he's Mickey Moran. And the word that he says is Komodo, which is atomic backwards. And I love the scene in the first strip in Warrior 1 where Mickey is at the atomic plant and it's attacked by terrorists, and he just happens to see the glass door that says atomic, but he sees it from the back, and he just says it. And, he hasn't turned into Marvelman in 20 years or something. And he, of course, the story goes from there, and it's great. But that's the genesis of that. So he's basically the British Shazam, and he'd been out of print for a while. He was popular in the 50s until those reprints ran out, maybe even into the early 60s when it finally wrapped up. But it would have been something that Alan Moore read as a kid. And so for him, it's, something that he's like revitalizing and revisiting. But of course, he's putting this more dark revisionist take of it, which of course is what we're talking about here with the Dark Age of comics.
Yeah. Well, I want to push back a little bit on the idea that Captain Marvel is a ripoff of Superman, and there's not any difference beyond that being a kid who says a magic word. I mean, that is a pretty big difference between the two characters. That Superman is an adult with a grown-up job and all the trappings and responsibilities of an adult, whereas Billy Batson, now that you mention it, he also is a reporter. But
yeah,
he's a kid reporter, and he's a
well. What they did is they basically took the Superman character and then the kid sidekick character and like made him one character.
Yeah,
right. They made him more relatable to kids.
Exactly.
But like but visually, they definitely like that was the ripoff of Superman. But yeah, they did a lot. They did a lot to build a different mythology for him, though. And then they had, of course, the whole family of characters, which, you know, Superman has a family of characters. So did Shazam, and so does Marvelman.
Yeah.
What Alan Moore does with the Marvel family is kind of interesting.
Yeah. But where I was going with that is that the original Captain Marvel and Marvelman has that appeal to kids, where this fantasy idea that you could be Captain Marvel or Marvelman too, if you knew the magic word. You still get to be a kid when you want to be, but you could also transform into this incredibly powerful persona that has all the power of an adult with none of the responsibilities of an adult, which is a pretty potent thing for kids. Grant Morrison in Super Gods points out that Moore's version of Marvelman inverts that fantasy, where Mickey, he's an adult, but he's like middle-aged, he's older, and when he transforms into Marvelman, it's basically becoming younger, more vital, and regaining his looks, his strength from when he was more youthful, or strength that maybe he never had. So it becomes a fantasy for adults to become younger and more strapping and powerful, and rather than a fantasy for kids to become an adult, which I found really interesting, given that, you know, Warrior is kind of aimed at more of an adult audience.
Well, and you know, you kind of see that in like Dark Knight Returns too, right? Like Batman is perpetually, you know, he's a kid that loses his parents and he grows up and he trains, and then he's perpetually like 20 or 30 years old forever. When Miller wrote him, he said, "No, like I can't. Batman's not going to be, you know, younger than me. Like I gotta do old Batman." And so Dark Knight Returns becomes about Batman trying to be young again, basically, right?
Yeah.
Like he's an old guy, but he tries to relive his, you know, with some success.
Yeah, no, he's like 50 years old or 60 or however old he's supposed to be. They never really make that clear, but he's much older and still like the biggest badass in Gotham, and beats up Superman. It's
pretty cool.
That's interesting. Yeah, it's kind of the fantasy of like, you can be an old guy and still be the toughest son of a bitch in town.
Yeah, it's very, very cool. I don't know. There's a lot of great stuff in here. So is there I don't know. Is there anything in Warrior that we didn't talk about that you feel like we should? I feel like some of the one-offs are fun. There's like a little time loop story in the first one, and there's, you know, some other little ones here and there. The two-part Warpsmith story was okay. Like I didn't love like the jargonish writing that Moore tried to do for like their speaking. Like I got what he was going for. It was funny. There was one line in it that was really funny, though. There's one of the Warpsmiths is being chastised by his like superiors for like screwing up, and he says, "I am at fault. I am impaled upon my own worthlessness." And I'm just gonna start saying that like when I make a mistake.
Yeah, no, I agree. It was mostly, I think those were interesting just to see that where Moore was taking those earlier ideas that trace so far back for him, rather than for them in and of themselves. But yeah, I guess we didn't talk about it yet, because there's also the Bo Jeffries saga that starts in issue 12, yeah. But I think that doesn't. It's one that's weird that's on the cusp, because most everything like finished, either concluded entirely like Spiral Path, or finished their first chapters or their first storylines in issue 12. Then 13 is kind of new stuff picking up, but the Bo Jeffries saga starts in 12. That one kind of feels like more getting back to those underground roots, doing something that's more silly and humorous. Works with Steve Parkhouse on that, who's fresh off of Spiral Path, doing something completely different from Spiral Path.
Just totally different style. And I was aware of Bo Jeffries saga from one of the reprints, but wasn't aware that it was one of the Warrior strips until we did this. Yeah, it's a weird little one. I mean, I didn't super love it just because it's not aesthetically like what I care about, but I saw what they were going for with it, and it was kind of interesting. And there's a few, I think it pops up in maybe four issues. There's not a ton. It doesn't go on forever. Spiral Path ends in issue 12, and it never reappears in the magazine. And the next longest running strip is Big Ben later on, which is a character that gets spun out of Marvelman, and Deskin writes the Big Ben strip.
Something that's interesting about Warrior is that it is supposed to be a shared universe where I guess Shandor is the distant past, and then Marvelman is the present.
Yes.
V for Vendetta is the near future, and Axel Pressbutton is the far future. And the two Moors had like a big timeline of everything that was involved. But that was another place where it kind of tied into Moore's Doctor Who stuff, because his work there was the 4D War, where it was this conflict between the Time Lords from the Doctor Who universe and some sort of group that I think was called like the Order of the Black Sun. And it seems like he just kind of took that and put it into the Marvelman past, where it was a conflict between the Warp Smiths and some sort of time travelers. And that's part of the whole timeline that he had worked out. There's been a lot of speculation that the plan was that V was Marvelman. But
oh, really?
Yeah,
that's kind of an interesting thought. I mean, I probably like that they're not the same, but at the same time, like the origins are, I guess, kind of similar. I never really thought about it, but in the Marvelman strip, he thinks he has this fantastical origin because he remembers the origin from the original comic book, but it turns out, of course, that it's all more nefarious than that, and that he was, created in the lab and whatever. And so was V. He was like experimented on in the concentration camp, and you never see his face, and you never know who he is. And so they potentially could have, I guess, been the same characters. And the timeline thing's interesting too. Not only merging all the strips, but looping back around to Axel Pressbutton. They wanted all of the Axel Pressbutton stuff to be in an actual timeline, and so like the stuff in My Stars, The Degradation, and the other strips that he was in were like later in his life or whatever, and this is like earlier, the stuff that's in Warrior.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's all pretty cool. I can't remember which issue it was, but in one of the issues, Steve Moore has a whole like segment about how everything's connected. We didn't really talk that much about V for Vendetta during this episode, but I think it's well known enough that people probably get it. But man, I love David Lloyd's art in it, and I love the storytelling in it. I think it's the strongest strip in the whole thing. But and it's the most prevalent strip, so I'll get to read more V as we go into the second half. But I'm pretty excited to read the back half of Warrior and talk about it.
Yeah, if I had to pick a favorite, I probably would go with Marvelman over V. But they're both strong. Even if I found that a little hard to get started with them this time around, they both grew on me a lot, and I think they're both really strong. You can see the influence of them rippling across the ages, if you will, and that's something we can talk about it next time, as well as kind of some of the impact and influence that these stories had on other creators and on the establishment of the dark age of comics.
Absolutely.
I guess actually one other thing I would touch on is Alan Davis as an artist. He was somebody who I was a little bit familiar with. I'd read some of his Excalibur issues that he did with Chris Claremont, not his solo ones, but seeing his work on Marvelman and Captain Britain really just drove home how incredible of an artist he is. And I think he's possibly the most underrated artist in comics, but he's certainly one of the most underrated. And
yeah, he's a master. He's fantastic. And I've enjoyed his stuff. I enjoyed the Captain Britain run. I read that when it got reprinted in trade paperback over here, like, I don't know, probably 25 years ago now, which is crazy. It's crazy that it's that long. You were talking about how you read V first in like 2000, I think you said, and I probably read it in 95 or something like that. Like, it's it's as old as we are, because I mean this magazine came out when I was like being born. Like, I was born in 1981.
Yeah.
These characters are as old as we are, which is a little hard to wrap my head around when I look back. But this is a really foundational piece, I think, of the puzzle.
And we'll dive into it even more in the future. Also maybe we could loop back to Steve Dillon real quick. Steve Dillon actually has a brother whose name suddenly escapes me, but he did a book called The Now of Brown, which is spelled Nao of Brown, that is more of a slice of life comic. It's not very similar to the work that Steve Dillon did, but I think any listeners who are Steve Dillon fans should really seek out his brother's work as well.
His Glenn Dillon is his name, Glyn. But the weird factoid that I noticed was that he designed the Batsuit for the most recent Batman movie, the Matt Reeves movie, The Batman.
Right. Yeah, he's
that's
a
kind of a
concept
cool
artist.
thing. Yeah, that's pretty neat.
Yeah, and I guess we could maybe say a little bit more about Steve Moore, Alan Moore's mentor. This Warrior really does seem to be one of the main kind of bodies of work that enduring bodies of work that he produced. He didn't, unlike a lot of the other creators here, he didn't really go on to have a big career in American comics or do like a Vertigo series or anything. He did some work on Moore's America's Best Comics imprint later, but yeah, I guess in a way, Axel Pressbutton and Shandor are some of his longest running, biggest works. So it's worth keeping that in mind as we dive into it.
Alan Moore wanted to hand over his run on Supreme to Steve Moore, and Rob Liefeld said, "I'm paying for Alan Moore, not Steve Moore," which is like kind of funny because he probably didn't know. Well, I mean, for one, Alan Moore's just the got all the clout and all the name recognition, but Steve Moore wasn't a nobody. I mean, he had been in comics just as long, and like you said, he was a mentor even to Alan
even
Moore.
longer.
And so and he ended up getting a little bit of work here and there through Alan Moore, like writing the novelization of the V for Vendetta film and things like that.
Yeah, his other kind of big work, he passed away in I believe 2014. His other major work is a novel. Well, actually, Alan Moore did not a graphic novel, an illustrated book and audio book about Steve Moore's life.
Was it the magic one about the serpent and the whatever, or is that something else?
You're talking about the Moon and Serpent bumper book of magic, which that was a collaboration with Alan Moore, and that I guess would be Steve Moore's final posthumous work, and that's like a book on like the history of magic and magic that they had started work in something like sometime in the aughts, I think. Alan Moore finally finished it, and it was published in 2024. Unearthing is the thing I was talking about. That's I have an extended essay on Stephen Moore's life written by Alan Moore, and a lot of it focuses on Steve Moore's own experiments and works in the occult, which both Moores were practitioners of. Steve Moore's other major work, I think, would be his novel Somnium, that was published in 2011. If any listeners want to go deeper on Steve Moore.
I'll have to check that out. Oh, with an afterword by Alan Moore as well. That's cool. Yeah, I guess we didn't mention that for Laser Eraser and Pressbutton, Steve Moore used the alias Pedro Henry, which is pretty fun. And so not only did they not have to credit all the strips in Warrior to Moore, because we had a tale of two Moores going on here, but also it was just kind of a fun pseudonym. And then there's a portion of the magazine where he interviews himself, where Steve Moore interviews Pedro Henry, and he has a back and forth dialogue with himself. So it's I think that's kind of fun.
I think that's in like issue 15, so we can talk about that.
Very cool.
Next time. So yeah, tune in next time for more on Moore. Well, thanks, John. This has been fun. Always a pleasure, and I'm looking forward to getting into that second half of Warrior.
Yeah, I'm jazzed. I can't wait for it. So we'll catch everybody next time.